Welcome back to History for Hours. Tonight, we drift into the late-night streets of Chicago, where the city hums under amber streetlights and power moves quietly through back rooms and handshakes. This is the world of Jackie Cerone, a man defined by patience rather than flash, where influence was built over decades, respect was cultivated slowly, and loyalty mattered more than noise. Most people couldn't survive a life like this, not because it was reckless, but because it required endurance, restraint, and the ability to stay calm while the ground constantly shifted beneath your feet. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Only if you genuinely enjoy these long, slow journeys through history's darker corners. And if you're listening right now, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love knowing where these stories travel. Now dim the lights, let the city's pulse soften, and settle in as we ease into the quiet, calculating story of Jackie Cerone. The night Chicago learned to whisper was the night Jackie Cerone learned to listen. Snow slid softly along the curbs on Taylor Street, muting the city the way a blanket hushes a restless child. Streetlights flickered like tired eyes. Somewhere in the distance, an elevated train groaned, metal on metal, carrying strangers home. Jackie stood with his hands in his coat pockets, collar turned up, watching the quiet as if it might say something back to him. He was still young then, younger than the weight he already carried, and he understood something most men didn't learn until much later. Noise draws attention, but silence draws power. Jackie wasn't born into headlines. He was born into a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's business, where favors mattered more than money and memory mattered more than muscle. His parents spoke Italian at home, the old words rolling like soft stones in the mouth, and Jackie learned early that language could be both a bridge and a wall. You chose which one you wanted it to be. He watched men on the corners as a boy, not with admiration but with curiosity. He noticed who talked the most and who talked just enough. He noticed who laughed loud and who smiled once and remembered everything. Jackie noticed patterns. He noticed timing. And most of all, he noticed consequences. His first jobs were small, forgettable things. Errands, deliveries, standing in places where nothing happened until it did. He learned how to wait without looking impatient, how to stand still without looking idle. When someone asked him a question, he answered clearly and stopped talking. When someone didn't ask, he didn't volunteer. It was a skill that made people lean toward him without realizing why. The men who mattered began to notice him the way you notice a door that never creaks or a clock that never runs fast. Reliable things fade into the background, but when you need them, they're there. Chicago in those years was a city learning how to grow sharp edges. Money moved fast, opportunities moved faster, and mistakes moved fastest of all. Jackie watched others trip over their own ambition, watched friendships sour over ego and impatience. He kept his own ambitions folded neatly inside, like a letter he didn't need to mail yet. When Jackie finally sat at tables where decisions were made, he didn't rush to fill the silence. He let other men talk themselves tired. He listened for what wasn't being said. He learned which names made voices drop, which subjects caused chairs to shift, which jokes were meant to test loyalty instead of humor. That was how he met Sam Giancana. Not in a blaze of drama, but in a room where the air felt heavy with unspoken calculations. Sam had a presence that filled space whether he spoke or not. Jackie didn't try to impress him. He didn't need to. He spoke when it mattered, and when he did, his words landed clean and stayed put. Sam liked that. Trust in that world wasn't given. It was built quietly, brick by brick, over years of not embarrassing anyone and never forgetting a favor. Jackie became someone you could rely on to handle things without leaving fingerprints, literal or otherwise. If Jackie said something was taken care of, it stayed taken care of. Outside, the city churned. Inside, Jackie's life settled into a rhythm of meetings, conversations, and careful steps forward. He dressed neatly but never flashily. He drove good cars but not loud ones. He lived well without advertising it. The louder men made mistakes. Jackie watched and learned. As the years passed, the stakes grew heavier. The city changed. The people changed. Some disappeared into history, others into prison cells. Jackie stayed where he was, adapting, adjusting, surviving. He understood that power wasn't about being seen, it was about being consulted. When Sam's world began to wobble, when alliances strained and eyes turned wary, Jackie found himself standing closer to the center than he ever planned. He didn't celebrate it. He didn't fear it either. Leadership, he believed, wasn't about commanding, it was about steadying. In rooms filled with tension, Jackie spoke softly. He reminded people of agreements made long ago, of lines that didn't need to be crossed. He played peacemaker when others wanted spectacle. Not because he was gentle, but because he was smart enough to know that chaos was expensive. Law enforcement knew his name, but not his voice. They watched him, followed him, waited for him to slip. Jackie didn't give them much to work with. He understood patience better than they did. Time, he knew, exposed everyone eventually, but you could decide how much it revealed. At home, he was quieter still. Family dinners, familiar routines, moments where the world outside felt distant and almost unreal. Jackie believed in separation. Some doors didn't need to open into the same room. As the decades rolled forward, the old rules began to crack. New laws, new tactics, new faces eager to prove themselves. Jackie felt the shift the way sailors feel a change in wind before the storm hits. He adjusted again, trimming sails, choosing caution over bravado. The day he realized how much the world had changed came not with sirens or shouting, but with a conversation that ended too neatly, too politely. Jackie walked out into the daylight, the city buzzing around him, and felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not fear, exactly, but awareness. The kind that tells you the game is entering a new phase. That night, he stood by his window, looking out over the city he had navigated so carefully for so long. Chicago still whispered, but the tone had shifted. Jackie listened as he always had. He knew the story wasn't over. It was just turning a page. And somewhere in the quiet, the consequences he'd spent a lifetime managing were beginning to knock. By morning, the snow had melted into a gray slush, and the city pretended nothing had happened. Chicago was good at that. Jackie moved through it like he always did, measured and unhurried. The echo of last night's thoughts still trailing him like a shadow that refused to stretch too far ahead. Part of surviving was knowing when to look back and when not to. Jackie's days settled into a pattern that looked ordinary from the outside. Coffee at the same place, nods exchanged with men who knew better than to ask questions. A slow walk past storefronts where the owners greeted him with a respect that wasn't forced. He didn't demand it. That was the point. People offered it because it made their lives easier. But beneath the routine, things were shifting. Sam's grip on the city, once ironclad, had begun to show hairline fractures. Whispers floated through back rooms and parked cars, conversations ending when Jackie stepped too close. Not because they feared him, but because they weren't sure where he stood. An uncertainty Jackie knew made people nervous. He didn't rush to correct them. Instead, he listened. He listened to who complained and who defended. He listened to the tone more than the words. Men talked about loyalty the way they talked about weather, casually until it turned bad. Jackie filed everything away. He had always believed that information was only useful if you knew when not to use it. Meetings became more frequent. Some were friendly, others tight with tension. Jackie found himself sitting beside Sam more often now, not as a show of status but as a matter of practicality. Sam trusted him. That trust had been earned slowly, through years of not needing reminders. In one smoke-filled room, voices rose and fell like a bad radio signal. Accusations hovered without landing. Someone suggested bold moves. Someone else suggested louder ones. Jackie waited, fingers folded, eyes steady. When he finally spoke, the room leaned in without realizing it. "We don't need noise," he said calmly. "We need stability. Everybody eats better when things stay predictable. No threats, no promises, just truth delivered flat and clean." The argument softened. It didn't end, but it bent. Later, one of the younger men pulled Jackie aside, admiration flickering behind his eyes. Jackie offered a polite smile and nothing else. Admiration was dangerous. It made people careless. As the months passed, pressure mounted from every direction. Law enforcement grew smarter, more patient. They weren't chasing headlines anymore. They were building cases like brick walls, slow and solid. Jackie noticed the surveillance patterns before others did. Cars that lingered a little too long. Faces that appeared in different places wearing different expressions. He adjusted. Routes changed. Conversations shortened. Decisions funneled through fewer hands. At home, the television murmured in the background while Jackie sat at the table. Paperwork spread neatly before him. Domestic calm mattered. It reminded him of what control actually felt like. He believed that if chaos never crossed the front door, it hadn't truly won. Yet even there, he felt the weight of time pressing in. Younger men didn't have the same patience. They wanted results fast, respect instantly. Jackie tried to guide them, to show by example rather than lecture. Some listened, some didn't. The city had a way of educating the stubborn. Sam's legal troubles deepened, and with them came long silences where answers used to be. Jackie didn't panic. He filled gaps quietly, keeping operations smooth, disputes contained. He never announced authority. He exercised it gently, like steering a car with two fingers on the wheel. People began to seek him out directly, not for permission, for reassurance. That was when Jackie understood the balance had shifted. Power had found him not because he chased it, but because he made it comfortable to exist around him. He was the man who reduced uncertainty, and uncertainty was the most expensive thing in their world. But power, he also knew, came with visibility, and visibility invited consequences. One afternoon, a lawyer spoke too carefully. Another day, a friend avoided eye contact just a second too long. Jackie recognized the signs. The long game was tightening. The walls weren't closing in yet, but they were being measured. He responded the only way he knew how, by slowing everything down. Fewer meetings, smaller circles. Old favors called in quietly, not for protection but for clarity. Jackie wanted to know exactly where he stood with everyone, even if the answer wasn't what he hoped. At night, he sometimes replayed moments from years ago, choices that had seemed small at the time. He didn't regret them. Regret wasted energy, but reflection sharpened awareness. Chicago outside his window kept breathing, restless and alive. Jackie understood that cities, like people, didn't care about your past. They only responded to how you moved through the present. And Jackie Cerone kept moving carefully, knowing the story was still unfolding, knowing the next chapter wouldn't announce itself with noise, but with a quiet shift you only noticed if you were listening. The first sign that the ground was shifting came on a quiet afternoon, the kind Jackie usually trusted. The sky hung low and pale, and the streets moved at half speed. Those were the days when mistakes felt unlikely. That's why he noticed immediately when a familiar face crossed to the other side of the street rather than walk past him. It wasn't fear. Fear was loud. This was calculation. Jackie didn't react. He kept his pace even, his expression neutral, like a man whose mind was somewhere else. But inside he made a note. One more thread tugged loose. One more signal that the city was rearranging itself. By evening, he was sitting in the back of a restaurant that had outlived 3 owners and 2 decades of changing tastes. The food was simple, the lighting forgiving. Men came and went, conversations overlapping like low music. Jackie listened more. Then he spoke, his presence settling the room without effort. Someone mentioned a deal that hadn't gone through. Another complained about pressure from outside forces, unnamed but understood. Jackie asked a single question, calm and precise, and the table quieted. He didn't challenge anyone. He didn't defend anyone either. He just wanted to hear how people explained themselves when they thought they had to. That was where the truth hid. Later, alone in his car, Jackie sat without turning the key. The dashboard clock blinked patiently. He thought about how power had changed shape over the years. It used to be about who could raise their voice the highest, make the biggest promise, draw the sharpest line. Now it was about who could endure silence the longest. Jackie had learned that lesson early. The next weeks unfolded like a slow tightening knot. Old allies checked in more often, their concern wrapped in casual tones. Younger men hovered, eager and restless, mistaking proximity for belonging. Jackie kept them at arm's length, not out of distrust, but out of necessity. Too much closeness blurred judgment. At home, the nights grew quieter. The television stayed off more often. Jackie preferred the sound of the house settling, the small creaks and clicks reminding him that not everything demanded his attention. He read the paper cover to cover, not for headlines but for patterns. Names repeating, stories shifting, language changing just enough to notice. One morning, a call came earlier than usual. The voice on the other end was steady but strained. A meeting was needed. No urgency stated, which meant urgency was assumed. The room they chose was plain, almost forgettable. That was intentional. Men arrived separately, spacing themselves out. Jackie took his seat and waited. When everyone was there, the conversation circled the problem without naming it. That was how things were done now. Directness invited records. Vagueness invited survival. Jackie spoke. Last, "We can't move like we used to," he said evenly. "And pretending we can only makes things worse. The city's changed. We either change with it or it changes us." No one argued. A few nodded. One man stared at the table, jaw tight. Jackie noticed but didn't press. Pressure made cracks visible too soon. Afterward, as chairs scraped back and coats were pulled on, a long-time associate lingered. He spoke softly, choosing his words with care. There were concerns. There were rumors. Jackie listened without interruption. When the man finished, Jackie placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. "Rumors grow when people don't understand what they're seeing," he said. "Let them grow. We'll know which ones matter." Driving home, Jackie took a longer route, passing through neighborhoods he rarely visited anymore. He saw kids playing under streetlights, couples arguing quietly on stoops, shopkeepers closing up for the night. Life went on in all its ordinary ways, untouched by the careful calculations happening behind closed doors. That contrast grounded him, but the sense of being watched didn't fade. If anything, it sharpened. Jackie felt it in the way phones rang and stopped, in the way conversations ended just a second too early. He wasn't afraid. Fear made people sloppy. What he felt was awareness, the kind that kept you awake without making you tired. One evening, he stood by the window, city lights stretching out like a field of stars. He thought about legacy not in terms of reputation, but in terms of choices. What lasted wasn't the noise you made, but the problems you prevented. Jackie had built his life around that idea. Still, he knew stories didn't end just because you wanted them to. They ended when circumstances decided they were done. Until then, all you could do was move carefully, speak precisely, and never forget that the quiet moments were often the most dangerous. Somewhere out there, decisions were being made that didn't include him. Jackie accepted that. Control was an illusion. Influence was real. An influence he believed still rested in his hands, for now. As he turned away from the window, the city kept humming, unaware of how close it was to another shift. Jackie Cerone prepared himself the only way he knew how, by staying still long enough to see which way the current would pull next. The days that followed moved with a strange rhythm, like a song Jackie half remembered but couldn't quite place. Nothing exploded, nothing collapsed, and that was what made it dangerous. Calm, when it lingered too long, was usually borrowed time. Jackie adjusted his routines without announcing it, the way a seasoned driver shifts lanes without touching the brakes. Different hours, different routes, familiar places, but entered from new angles. He didn't do this out of fear. He did it out of respect for the game as it existed now, not as it once had. One afternoon, he met an old friend at a cafe that smelled of burned coffee and history. The man had been around since before Jackie's name carried weight, back when loyalty was tested in smaller ways. They spoke about families, about people who had moved away, about weather that no longer followed the patterns they remembered. Everything but business. That was the point. When the friend finally leaned back and said, "Things feel different," Jackie nodded once. "They always do, right before people admit it," Jackie replied. The friend studied him. "You worried?" Jackie smiled faintly. Worry wastes time. I pay attention. That night, Jackie dreamed of his younger self, standing on a street corner with nothing but confidence and borrowed ambition. He woke before dawn, the dream clinging to him like fog. He sat at the edge of the bed, thinking about how certainty had once come so easily. Back then, the world felt smaller, simpler. Now it was vast, layered, filled with invisible lines that shifted when no one was looking. As morning broke, a message arrived. Through a channel so indirect most people would have missed it. A third party had asked a question, which reached a second party, which eventually circled back to Jackie in the form of a casual remark. The question wasn't threatening. It was curious. Curiosity was never harmless. Jackie spent the day listening. He let others talk themselves into corners and then out again. He watched who spoke confidently and who chose their words like stepping stones. By evening, a picture began to form. Not a clear one, but clear enough. There was a hunger in the air, not for chaos, but for opportunity. That hunger often led people to forget who had already paid the price for stability. At a quiet gathering later that week, Jackie addressed a small group, his tone even almost conversational. He reminded them of past winters, of lean years, of how survival had come from patience, not bravado. He didn't lecture, he shared. That distinction mattered. Some nodded with understanding. Others listened politely, already planning something else. Jackie noticed. Driving home, he passed a familiar intersection where a deal had once gone sideways decades ago. He slowed without meaning to, memory pulling at him. Back then, mistakes were loud. Now they whispered. He thought about the younger men again, their restless energy, their need to prove something before the world told them who they were. Jackie had been like that once. The difference was timing. He'd come up when the rules were harsh but clear. These days, the rules shifted depending on who was watching. Late that night, Jackie received a visit he hadn't expected but wasn't surprised by. The man stood in the doorway, respectful, nervous in a way that tried to hide itself. They talked in the living room, voices low. The visitor spoke about pressures, about people promising shortcuts and protection. Jackie listened carefully, then asked a few gentle questions. The answers confirmed what he already suspected. When the man left, Jackie locked the door and stood there for a moment, hand resting on the knob. The house felt heavier somehow, as if it understood what was coming before he did. He poured himself a drink he didn't really want and sat by the window again. The city glowed back at him, indifferent and eternal. Jackie didn't resent that. Cities outlasted everyone. That was their power. He thought about legacy again, but this time in more personal terms. Not what people would say, but what would remain stable because he'd been there. Stability was invisible. People only noticed it when it vanished. By the end of the week, Jackie made a decision that would ripple outward in subtle ways. He stepped back from one circle and leaned slightly into another, redistributing attention like weight on a scale. No announcements, no declarations, just movement. Some interpreted it as weakness. Jackie knew better. As another quiet night settled over the city, he turned off the lights earlier than usual and let the darkness take the room. Somewhere beyond his walls, plans were forming, alliances testing their strength, stories being written without his consent. Jackie Cerone closed his eyes, fully awake, fully present, waiting not for the storm, but for the moment when the wind changed direction again. Jackie woke to another gray morning, the kind where the city seemed caught between movement and hesitation. He poured his coffee slowly, savoring the warmth more than the taste, because warmth reminded him that life still existed outside the calculations, outside the measured steps he took every day. The snow from the past weeks had melted into muddy streets, and children splashed through puddles as if nothing mattered, oblivious to patterns, consequences, or decisions that shaped the adult's world. That was the rhythm Jackie understood better than anyone. Life was full of small movements, each one quietly shaping the next, like currents beneath still water. The challenge was to move with the currents, not against them, without causing ripples too large or too sudden. He had learned that lesson early. When mistakes were loud, lessons were painful, and survival required patience. By mid-morning, Jackie was walking along his usual route to the office, nodding to familiar shopkeepers, exchanging a few words with neighbors who didn't realize they were speaking with a man who had navigated the undercurrents of the city for decades. He noticed things others didn't. The new pattern of cars outside a building, the angle at which a man held his coat, a woman watching a delivery truck with keen interest. All signals, all pieces of a puzzle that never stopped shifting. Inside the office, the day's work began without fanfare. Jackie preferred quiet, unhurried mornings, the kind that allowed him to think clearly. Reports came in, not flashy ones but the steady trickle of information. A shipment arrived, a contract was fulfilled, a dispute resolved before anyone noticed. Jackie checked the facts, cross-referenced names and numbers, and made a note of anything unusual. He never acted on impulse. Impulse invited mistakes. Later that afternoon, he received a call that was indirect enough to seem casual but precise enough to command attention. A colleague from another branch wanted to meet. Jackie didn't respond immediately. He let the call sit, weighing timing, assessing intent, imagining what could go wrong and what could go right. When he finally agreed, it was on his terms, not theirs. The meeting took place in a quiet restaurant on the edge of town. The room smelled of old wood and simmering sauces. Jackie arrived slightly early, sitting in the corner, observing the flow of the room, noting exits and entrances, listening to the rhythm of conversations around him. When his colleague arrived, they exchanged greetings, polite and understated. Jackie let the conversation meander before steering it toward the topic at hand. He asked questions more than he answered, guiding subtly, allowing information to surface naturally. By the time they left, Jackie had what he needed: details, nuances, and understanding, without anyone realizing how much he had learned. Returning home, Jackie reflected on the way the city moved, the way people moved through it, and his role within that movement. Power, he knew, was rarely loud. It was quiet, patient, and almost invisible. The men who sought attention often stumbled, their mistakes public and irreversible. Jackie preferred to watch, to wait, to let time reveal the truth. That approach had kept him alive, respected, and trusted for longer than most men in his world. That evening, Jackie sat by the window, the city lights flickering like distant stars. He thought about the younger men, the restless energy that sought to prove itself before it understood the consequences. He remembered his own youth, how ambition had burned hot and fast. Time had cooled that fire, tempered it into awareness, into precision, into understanding that patience often yielded more than force. Jackie's mind wandered to his family, the small moments that kept him grounded, the laughter at the dinner table, the quiet exchanges in the kitchen, the feeling of safety in routines that no one outside could disturb. Those were the moments that mattered, the invisible anchor in a world defined by shifting alliances and constant assessment. Night deepened, and the city settled into its quieter rhythms. Jackie turned off the lights and allowed himself a moment of reflection. The day had been ordinary, yet filled with careful decisions, measured steps, and subtle victories. That was how he navigated the world, one small, deliberate action at a time, each connected to the last, each laying the groundwork for the next. He had learned that life, like influence, was rarely about bold moves. It was about consistency, awareness, and the patience to wait until the right moment revealed itself. Jackie Cerone remained awake long after. The city seemed asleep, listening to the quiet hum of life around him. Every sound, every shadow, every detail mattered. In his world, survival was built on attention, respect, and the silent power of understanding before speaking, of seeing before acting. And Jackie knew that as long as he kept listening, kept observing, and kept moving with purpose, the city would continue to bend around him. Not because it had to, but because it understood slowly that some forces were steady, patient, and inevitable. The next morning came quietly, the kind of day when even the city seemed to hesitate before fully waking. Jackie sat at the kitchen table, coffee steaming in front of him, a notebook open with lines half-filled and ideas half-formed. The work of observation never stopped. Details from yesterday's conversations, the shifts in tone, even the pauses, All of it had to be recorded somewhere in his mind, if nowhere else. Patterns emerged slowly, imperceptibly, but Jackie had a way of seeing them before anyone else noticed. A knock at the door came mid-morning, polite and measured. Jackie expected no one, but he answered without suspicion. A courier stood there, delivering a small envelope with no return address, no markings beyond Jackie's name. He tore it open carefully. Inside were two things: a note with a single sentence, "Everything you know is shifting," and a photograph of a building he knew well, the one at the corner of Harrison and 18th. Nothing else. Jackie didn't flinch. The world had always been shifting, and messages like these were just a reminder to stay alert. He made a mental note to observe the building later, casually, as if he were passing by on an errand. Nothing more. Subtlety was often more powerful than confrontation. By late afternoon, Jackie was on the move. He walked through neighborhoods he hadn't visited in months, places where familiar faces now seemed unfamiliar, where windows reflected light differently, and streets held smells he hadn't noticed before. He stopped in a small cafe, ordered nothing but water, and sat near the back, observing. People came and went, conversations overlapping. Jackie noticed two men who seemed out of place, glancing around like they were measuring something. He didn't confront them, didn't make his presence known. Instead, he shifted slightly in his chair, adjusted his posture, made a small movement of his hand. It was enough. The men exchanged glances, hesitated, and then moved on. Control didn't always need authority. Sometimes it just needed awareness. Evening brought him to a meeting with one of the older men in the organization. The man had been a figure of influence for decades, and his insights were invaluable. They discussed operations, priorities, and challenges, but the conversation was layered. Beneath the surface were warnings, suggestions, and subtle tests. Jackie responded with calm questions, letting the other man speak more than he did, allowing information to surface naturally. By the end, he had more than just data. He had a clear sense of loyalty, hesitation, and potential missteps without anyone realizing he had gained such an advantage. Driving home, Jackie reflected on how much had changed over the years. Loyalty wasn't what it used to be. Authority wasn't demanded. It was quietly acknowledged or easily ignored. And opportunity. Opportunity was a quiet predator, waiting for men to misstep, to misjudge, to act faster than thought aloud. He understood all this intuitively, a skill honed by decades of living in the edges, in the spaces between decisions, in the pauses others dismissed. That night, Jackie sat by the window, city lights glowing like a constellation beneath him. He poured himself a drink, not to drink but to mark the ritual of reflection. He thought about the young men eager to prove themselves, about the older men clinging to their routines, and about the unknown forces quietly observing from afar. Jackie knew that patience wasn't just a virtue, it was a weapon. He had seen impatience destroy men far stronger, smarter, or bolder than he was. The smallest miscalculation, a single overlooked sign, could unravel months of careful work. And yet, the reverse was true. The right action at the right time, executed without fanfare, could shift balance without anyone noticing until it was too late to resist. He thought about the photograph he had received that morning. The building, the single sentence, it was a reminder that nothing stayed static, that even a man like him had to continue moving, adapting, listening. He mapped out possibilities, prepared for contingencies, and reminded himself that awareness was a skill to be maintained, not assumed. Hours later, when the city was almost silent and the hum of life had softened to distant echoes, Jackie closed his eyes and leaned back. The world outside continued unaware, but inside, he had seen, observed, and accounted for another layer of uncertainty. That was power, Jackie knew. Not the loud declarations of control, but the quiet mastery of knowledge, patience, and presence. And as he finally let himself rest, he understood one enduring truth. Survival wasn't about reaction, nor was it about fear. It was about movement, anticipation, and the quiet certainty that when the city shifted, you were ready, not by force, but by foresight. Jackie Cerone had mastered that long ago. The city might change, but he moved with it, steady, deliberate, and unseen, a constant in a world of variables. The morning sun came in pale, diffused streaks through the blinds, brushing the edges of Jackie's desk with light. He had already been awake for an hour, the notebook open in front of him, filled with meticulous notes, details from yesterday, reminders about people, schedules, and subtle patterns he noticed throughout the city. To anyone else, it might have looked like obsession. To Jackie, it was preparation. Patterns revealed themselves not to those in a rush, but to those who paused and watched, who understood that small, consistent observations could reveal truths the loudest men would never see. By mid-morning, Jackie was out walking the city streets again. This was part ritual, part reconnaissance. He greeted shopkeepers, nodded to street cleaners, exchanged a brief word with a taxi driver who had been there for decades. All of these interactions were not idle. They were threads, connecting him to the unseen currents running under the city's surface. Jackie had learned early that knowing who moved where, when, and why was as valuable as having allies. He paused at a corner where the city had recently changed. A new business had taken over a building he knew well, its owners unfamiliar, the staff alert and watchful. Jackie observed quietly, noting patterns, the times deliveries arrived, the people entering the building, the way neighbors reacted to activity around it. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but for someone who knew what to look for, the signals were clear. Later, Jackie met an old associate at a cafe tucked into a side street. The man had been a fixture in the city long before Jackie had reached prominence, and he carried with him knowledge that spanned decades. They spoke in layers, the surface conversation about family, about local news, about minor inconveniences. But underneath, there were messages, cues, and tests. Jackie listened carefully, letting the words drift in before reacting, understanding that what was said and what was left unsaid often mattered equally. "You've been quiet," the associate said finally, his tone casual but weighted. "Too quiet." Jackie leaned back, sipping his coffee slowly. "Quiet doesn't mean absent," he replied. "It just means observing. Sometimes that's louder than words." The man nodded, as if that made sense, though he knew better. He always knew better. By evening, Jackie was back in his own neighborhood, walking the streets with purpose, but without urgency. He passed buildings, noting subtle changes, new faces in windows, altered routines in shops, the shifting rhythms of life that most people ignored. Each observation was a puzzle piece. Each step was deliberate. To Jackie, the city was a living map, its currents visible only to those who moved attentively. Later, in his study, Jackie reviewed the notes he had taken over the day. Small patterns emerged when viewed together. Repeated interactions, unusual schedules, hints of tension between people who were supposed to be allies. Jackie didn't panic. Panic was for the inexperienced. Instead, he began plotting possibilities, anticipating movements, and calculating how best to respond. Not immediately, but when the moment was right. Jackie understood one enduring truth. Control was never about force alone. Force was visible, predictable, and eventually resisted. Influence, on the other hand, was quiet. It worked in layers, in shadows, through relationships and understanding, through timing and awareness. That was the power he had built, the power that allowed him to navigate a city that constantly shifted around him. Before bed, Jackie walked to the window, looking out at the glowing lights of the city. Somewhere in the distance, cars moved, windows flickered with life, and people went about their routines unaware of the subtle games at play. He allowed himself a moment to reflect, not on fear or danger, but on awareness, patience, and the quiet victories of observation. As Jackie turned away from the window, he felt the familiar weight of responsibility, not as a burden, but as a skill honed over decades. Survival was not luck. It was preparation, foresight, and the ability to remain calm while the currents shifted. And in that, Jackie Cerone remained unmatched. Steady, deliberate, and always ready for the next move the city demanded. Even as the night deepened, Jackie stayed awake a while longer, not restless, but alert, listening to the quiet pulse of life. Around him, every shadow, every distant sound, Every small anomaly mattered, and Jackie knew that the city, vast and indifferent, moved on. But he moved with it, unseen, measured, and entirely aware. The next morning arrived with the soft hum of the city waking slowly, and Jackie Cerone was already in motion. Even in the quiet of his own home, his mind was alert, scanning possibilities, replaying details from the previous day. He wasn't anxious. He never let anxiety govern him. Instead, he treated each observation as a piece of a larger puzzle, a mosaic of patterns and intentions. Today, he would follow one thread that had piqued his curiosity, the subtle interactions near that building he had been observing for days. Jackie dressed in plain clothes, nothing to attract attention, and stepped onto the streets that had become his living map. Each step was deliberate, but he moved with ease, blending into the rhythm of morning traffic, waving at familiar faces, nodding at passers-by. No one knew the depth of his attention, nor would they suspect the calculations behind his calm demeanor. The building at Harrison and 18th was quiet, but Jackie didn't need noise to confirm activity. The slight tension in the air, the shifting shadows behind frosted windows, the pattern of deliveries arriving slightly earlier than usual, all of it spoke louder than any conversation could. He noted the details carefully, storing them in his mind for later comparison. By mid-morning, Jackie had arranged a meeting with a trusted associate from another district. The man was careful and observant, and Jackie valued that about him. They sat in a small diner with checkered floors, talking quietly over coffee. Conversation drifted through neutral topics first. News, mutual acquaintances, the weather. But beneath it all were subtle exchanges of information, understanding, and confirmation. "You've been paying attention," the associate said, not as a question but as a statement. Jackie nodded. Slightly. "Someone has to. Otherwise, the world moves past you." The associate leaned back, understanding more in the silence than the words. They spoke for another hour, their conversation a blend of context, assessment, and careful suggestions. When Jackie left, he had a clearer picture of the underlying dynamics at play, who was aligned, who was hesitant, and who might be positioning themselves for advantage. Returning home, Jackie reflected on the way the city had changed over the years. Influence was no longer about visible power or loud proclamations. It was subtle, often invisible, and always dependent on awareness. The men who rushed to make themselves known often stumbled. Those who waited, who observed, who calculated, those were the ones who endured. Jackie had survived by mastering that art. That evening, Jackie received another indirect message. A name mentioned casually in conversation by someone who didn't realize how carefully he listened. He made a note of it, not acting immediately, but filing it away for context. Every piece of information, no matter how small, could become crucial in time. Later, he walked through the neighborhood, observing the city as if it were a living organism. The familiar streets seemed to shift under the lens of his attention, revealing subtle changes. New faces and windows, altered routines, small anomalies in behavior that would escape most people entirely. Jackie made mental notes of each one. Night fell, and Jackie returned to his home, where he sat by the window and allowed the city lights to wash over him. He poured a drink, not out of desire, but as a ritual to mark the day's reflection. Thoughts drifted to younger men, eager and restless, always chasing recognition, often missing the cues that guided survival. Jackie had been that man once. Time had tempered him, teaching him patience, observation, and quiet influence. As midnight approached, Jackie began reviewing his notes once more. He didn't rush, he never rushed. The world moved quickly enough without his interference. Each observation, each interaction, each detail had to be understood in context. It was in the careful accumulation of these insights that power quietly revealed itself. And as he finally leaned back in his chair, listening to the faint hum of distant traffic, Jackie understood something that had never changed. The city could shift, people could move unpredictably, and alliances could falter, but the one constant was awareness. Jackie Cerone had spent decades cultivating it. Tonight, as every night, He was ready for whatever the currents of life might bring next. The city slept, unaware of the quiet orchestration happening in the shadows, the invisible patterns being tracked, the deliberate patience guiding every decision. Jackie Cerone, ever vigilant, watched and waited, steady as ever, knowing that in patience, foresight, and quiet observation, he held a power that few could ever understand. The next morning arrived with a pale, filtered sunlight that barely touched the streets. Jackie Cerone was already awake, sitting at his kitchen table with his notebook open, the page filled with lines of observations, names, and notes that would appear meaningless to anyone else but were carefully coded in his mind. For him, the city was a living organism, and he was its quiet observer, its patient strategist. Every movement, every pause, every interaction carried information. And information, he had learned, was more powerful than action alone. Jackie's walk that morning was purposeful but unassuming. He passed through streets that had shifted subtly overnight. New graffiti on a brick wall, a delivery van parked slightly differently, a shopkeeper waving at someone he didn't recognize. All small details, invisible to most but not to Jackie. He cataloged them mentally, connecting them with patterns he had observed over weeks. The city, in its vastness, was revealing itself piece by piece. By late morning, Jackie met an older associate at a diner tucked away on a quieter street. The man had been part of the city's rhythm for decades, someone who understood that influence was often invisible and patience could be more powerful than confrontation. Their conversation was casual on the surface, local news, shared acquaintances, mundane complaints, but each phrase was carefully measured, each pause deliberate. Jackie listened more than he spoke, letting the other man reveal what he might not have intended. "You're thinking too much about the small things," the associate said after a while, smirking slightly. "Or maybe not enough." Jackie tilted his head, a subtle smile tugging at his lips. "Small things matter," he replied. "They always add up, and the world only seems big to those who aren't paying attention." By afternoon, Jackie had returned to the area near Harrison and 18th, the building that had been a point of focus for him. He observed from a distance, pretending to browse the shelves of a nearby shop while keeping the building in his peripheral vision. Patterns emerged again, deliveries arriving slightly earlier, faces in the windows shifting in alignment, subtle changes in behavior that suggested internal adjustments. Jackie made mental notes, knowing that each small change could signify larger movements. Later that day, he met briefly with a younger associate who had been showing initiative but lacked patience. Jackie had taken the time to mentor him, teaching subtle lessons about timing, observation, and influence. "Power isn't always loud," Jackie explained, walking alongside him. "It's the quiet things you notice, the pauses you respect, and the people you understand before they realize you do." By evening, Jackie returned home, where he sat by the window, watching the city transition into night. Lights flickered on in apartments, cars moved with a quiet rhythm, and the hum of distant traffic created a soft undercurrent of life. He reflected on the day, noting the small victories, the information gathered, the patterns confirmed, the loyalty quietly reinforced. He poured a drink, not to indulge, but to mark a moment of reflection, the ritual grounding him after hours of observation. The city, with all its noise and motion, was predictable in its unpredictability, and Jackie thrived in that space between chaos and order. Late at night, as the streets quieted and the hum of distant life softened, Jackie reviewed his notes once more. Names, faces, shifts in behavior, the timing of movements, all interconnected. Each observation was a thread in the larger tapestry, a tapestry that he had spent decades learning to read. Jackie understood something essential. Survival was not about reacting first, it was about understanding first. Action without awareness was reckless. Influence without patience was fleeting. And power, real power, came from the ability to anticipate, to observe, and to move with precision when the moment revealed itself. The city slept, oblivious to the intricate layers of observation, the silent calculations, and the quiet control exercised by a man who had spent a lifetime mastering the art of presence. Jackie Cerone remained vigilant, patient, and deliberate, knowing that in the shadows of everyday life, he held a constant, enduring influence that no one could see but everyone felt. As he finally leaned back, allowing the city's dim glow to fill the room, Jackie reflected on one enduring truth. The world shifted, people moved unpredictably, and circumstances changed. But those who understood patience, observation, and quiet timing could navigate any current without resistance. And Jackie Cerone, in his quiet, steady way, had mastered that art completely. The night deepened, and Jackie finally allowed himself to rest, knowing the city's currents were never static, and that when the next day arrived, he would continue moving with them, silent, deliberate, and entirely aware. The morning light filtered through Jackie's blinds in soft, golden streaks, marking the beginning of another day that promised nothing obvious yet held countless subtle possibilities. Jackie Cerone was already awake, seated at his familiar kitchen table, his notebook open, the lines on the pages dense with observations, contacts, and reminders. Over decades, he had learned that control wasn't a loud proclamation. It was the quiet accumulation of understanding, the careful alignment of timing, people, and knowledge. Today would be no different. Jackie's first stop was the city streets, walking calmly, observing every shift in behavior and environment. The streets were alive in ways that outsiders couldn't perceive. The careful timing of a shopkeeper opening a shutter, a delivery van that paused slightly longer than usual, a pedestrian who seemed out of place among familiar routines. Each anomaly mattered. Jackie didn't rush. He moved with the city, part of it, yet apart, quietly noting every thread that might become significant later. By mid-morning, he met a longtime associate, a man who had seen the city change in ways that few could comprehend. Their conversation began casually, discussing neutral topics, but Jackie's attention was never idle. He noted subtle inflections, small hesitations, unspoken cues that revealed far more than words alone. Relationships, he knew, were often defined by what wasn't said. The pauses, the glances, the deliberate omissions. "You've always had a way of noticing what others overlook," the associate said, his tone casual but his eyes sharp, measuring. Jackie smiled faintly, not out of pride, but acknowledgement. "Noticing is only half of it," he said. "Understanding is the other." By afternoon, Jackie returned to the building he had been monitoring near Harrison and 18th. Today, he observed from a discreet distance, blending in with pedestrians, his attention absorbing every detail, the timing of the deliveries, the subtle movements of people, entering and exiting, the faint shifts in behavior of those around the perimeter. Jackie cataloged it all mentally, recognizing patterns and potential vulnerabilities that most would never see. Later, he met a younger associate, a man eager to prove himself. Jackie used the encounter as a teaching moment, demonstrating patience and subtle influence. "Timing," he explained, "isn't just when you act. It's when you don't act, when you watch, when you let the currents show themselves. That's how you gain true control." The young man nodded, absorbing the lesson, though it would take years before he fully understood it. Evening approached, and Jackie found himself walking the familiar streets of his neighborhood. The city had a rhythm he knew intimately, and he used it to gauge subtle changes. Faces in windows, the pacing of pedestrians, the hum of traffic, all provided information. He wasn't merely walking. He was reading the city like a book, absorbing context that others would overlook. Returning home, Jackie sat by the window, the city lights glowing like a constellation beneath him. He poured himself a drink, not for indulgence, but as a ritual, a marker of reflection. Today had been productive. Connections reinforced, patterns confirmed, lessons passed on. Yet Jackie knew that vigilance was never complete. The city was ever shifting, and influence required continual attention, patience, and awareness. As night fell, Jackie reviewed his notes once more. Names, faces, movements, and subtle behaviors were all interconnected, forming a larger map of influence and understanding. Every small detail mattered. Every overlooked cue could be the difference between advantage and missed opportunity. Jackie had long since learned that true power was invisible, quiet, and strategic. something he had cultivated over decades. In the silence of his home, with the hum of the distant city as background, Jackie reflected on one truth that had guided him his entire life. Survival and influence were not determined by force or noise, but by patience, observation, and strategic timing. He had mastered that art, and it had carried him through countless changes, challenges, and uncertainties. As he leaned back, watching the city's lights flicker in the night, Jackie Cerone allowed himself a moment of calm. The city moved, people moved, life continued its unpredictable rhythm, but he moved with it, deliberate and unseen, ever ready for whatever came next. In that quiet mastery, Jackie knew he had created a power that was enduring, resilient, and completely his own. And with that, he finally let the night embrace him, resting not from fear or exhaustion, but from the satisfaction of being prepared, aware, and in control of the currents that few others could ever perceive. The morning broke with a crisp chill in the air, and Jackie Cerone was already awake before the city had fully stirred. There was a subtle joy in those early hours, a quiet time when the world had not yet imposed its distractions and every observation could be made with clarity. Jackie sat at his kitchen table, the notebook in front of him, filled with meticulous notes, diagrams, and coded reminders. To an outsider, it might have seemed like obsessive scribbling, but for Jackie, it was the lifeblood of control, the map of an invisible territory only he truly understood. By mid-morning, Jackie had begun his rounds through the familiar streets of the city. Each step was deliberate, each glance purposeful. He noted small changes: a new face behind the counter of a corner store, the slightly altered route of a delivery truck, a pedestrian who hesitated too long at a crosswalk. These were insignificant to most, but to Jackie they were signals, subtle threads that could lead to larger insights. Jackie paused near a quiet street where a small coffee shop had recently changed ownership. He observed the subtle differences, the way the new employees interacted, the timing of their suspect. Jackie's notebook would later reflect these observations, but much of the real understanding resided in his memory, where it could be used without exposure. Night fell, and Jackie settled by his window, looking out over the city he had come to know intimately. Lights flickered in buildings, cars moved quietly along familiar routes, and people went about their routines unaware of the invisible web of observation threading through their lives. Jackie sipped a drink, a ritual to mark the day's reflection, and thought about the lessons it had offered. Every detail mattered. Every interaction could reveal information, if one only looked closely enough. He reflected on the lessons of years past, the careful cultivation of patience, observation, and quiet influence. The city changed, people changed, but those who moved with understanding, not haste, survived and thrived. Jackie had lived by that truth for decades, and it had never failed him. As the city's hum softened into night, Jackie reviewed his mental map one last time. Names, faces, subtle behaviors, and timing, all interconnected in a network of understanding that few could even imagine. Control, real control, was not about force. It was about insight, timing, and patience. Jackie Cerone had mastered that art, and as he leaned back, he felt the quiet satisfaction of a life lived with awareness and purpose. Tomorrow, he knew, would bring new observations, new patterns, and new opportunities. And Jackie, ever vigilant, would continue to move quietly through the currents of the city, unseen but always present, patient, deliberate, and entirely aware. The morning light spilled over the rooftops in soft, golden streaks, filtering through the blinds of Jackie Cerone's home. He was already awake, seated at his kitchen table with the familiar notebook open before him. Pages upon pages of notes, diagrams, and reminders lay neatly, each marking a thread of observation, a subtle shift in behavior, or a small insight into the rhythms of the city he had learned to read like a book. Jackie didn't just exist in the city, he absorbed it, understood it, and moved with it. Every detail mattered, every shift had significance, and every person carried hints of patterns most would never notice. That morning, Jackie began with the streets he knew best. He walked slowly, deliberately, noting the subtle changes that others overlooked. The new placement of a trash bin, The way sunlight hit a particular window at an exact hour, the pacing of a pedestrian who appeared out of place. These small deviations weren't trivial, they were information. Jackie cataloged them silently, his mind linking each observation to the broader web he had been weaving for years. By mid-morning, he visited a local cafe, a neutral space where he could observe without drawing attention. From his table by the window, he noted interactions, familiar faces greeting each other with minor variations in tone, gestures slightly altered from the day before. To anyone else, it was ordinary life, but to Jackie, it was a living record of connections, loyalty, and subtle influence. Each action told a story if you were patient enough to read it. Later, Jackie met briefly with an associate who had shown both ambition and discretion. Jackie valued such traits but had learned through decades of experience that ambition without patience often led to mistakes. Their conversation was casual in tone, discussing mundane matters and shared acquaintances. But beneath the surface flowed an exchange of subtle confirmations and observations. Jackie's eye for detail, combined with the associate's awareness, allowed them to maintain a quiet yet precise understanding of the neighborhood's shifting dynamics. By afternoon, Jackie returned to the building near Harrison and 18th, a place that had drawn his attention for weeks. He watched from a distance, noting the arrival and departure patterns, the timing of deliveries, and the brief exchanges between individuals. Nothing appeared out of the ordinary to passers-by, yet Jackie recorded everything mentally, connecting seemingly isolated threads into a coherent pattern that could guide future decisions. Later in the day, Jackie mentored a younger member of his circle, reinforcing lessons he had learned through experience. Control isn't always obvious, he explained as they walked together. It's quiet, it's deliberate, and it's patient. Most people chase after the wrong things: power, recognition, speed, but the real strength is understanding first and acting only when the time is right. The young man listened, absorbing the lesson even if he didn't yet fully understand its depth. As evening settled, Jackie returned home. From his vantage point by the window, he watched the city lights come alive, each flickering window and moving vehicle a part of the city's silent symphony. Patterns emerged once again. Repeated interactions, familiar routines, subtle shifts in behavior that had developed over the day. Jackie made mental notes, knowing that in observation lay his strength. He poured a drink, not for indulgence, but as a ritual of reflection. The day had been rich in small victories. Observations confirmed, connections understood, insights reinforced. Jackie knew the value of patience and vigilance. The city moved quickly, but his careful attention allowed him to navigate its currents without error. Night deepened, and the hum of distant traffic softened into the background. Jackie reviewed his mental map one last time, connecting threads, noting potential opportunities, and preparing for the next day. Survival, influence, and understanding were inseparable. He had mastered the art of patience, subtlety, and strategic awareness over decades, and these skills had become his defining strength. Tomorrow, Jackie knew, would bring new interactions, new patterns, and new shifts in the city's rhythms. And he would move with them as he always had, quietly, deliberately, and entirely aware. The foundation had been set. The threads were woven. All that remained was the final understanding of how it would unfold. Jackie Cerone sat in his favorite chair by the window. The city sprawled out beneath him like a living, breathing organism. The streets glimmered with lights that reflected both opportunity and motion, each building a node of stories, each passerby a thread in a vast tapestry. Over decades, Jackie had learned to read this tapestry with patience, precision, and quiet understanding. Every shift in behavior, every subtle nuance, had been catalogued and interpreted, forming a map of influence few could ever perceive. Tonight, he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He thought of the countless days spent walking these streets, observing, listening, connecting the invisible threads that defined the rhythms of life around him. Jackie understood more than most. Power wasn't about dominance or loud declarations. It was about subtlety, foresight, and timing. The city moved in currents, and he had learned to flow with them, to move silently yet decisively when the right moment arrived. Memories of past encounters flickered through his mind, mentoring younger associates, confirming loyalty with a quiet word, noticing the patterns that others overlooked. Each memory reminded him that influence was cumulative, built over years through observation, patience, and deliberate action. Jackie knew that the true measure of mastery was invisibility, when your presence shaped events and outcomes without ever drawing attention to yourself. As he sipped his drink, Jackie contemplated the lessons the city had taught him. The small things mattered: a hesitation at a doorway, a delivery arriving early, a fleeting glance exchanged between strangers. All were part of the language he had learned to understand. Influence, control, and survival were not immediate. They were cultivated, woven silently over time, and Jackie had quietly, deliberately, and entirely aware. The foundation had been set. The threads were woven. All that remained was the final understanding of how it would unfold. Jackie Cerone sat in his favorite chair by the window. The city sprawled out beneath him like a living, breathing organism. The streets glimmered with lights that reflected both opportunity and motion, each building a node of stories, each passerby a thread in a vast tapestry. Over decades, Jackie had learned to read this tapestry with patience, precision, and quiet understanding. Every shift in behavior, every subtle nuance, had been catalogued and interpreted, forming a map of influence few could ever perceive. Tonight, he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He thought of the countless days spent walking these streets, observing, listening, connecting the invisible threads that defined the rhythms of life around him. Jackie understood more than most. Power wasn't about dominance or loud declarations. It was about subtlety, foresight, and timing. The city moved in currents, and he had learned to flow with them, to move silently yet decisively when the right moment arrived. Memories of past encounters flickered through his mind, mentoring younger associates, confirming loyalty with a quiet word, noticing the patterns that others overlooked. Each memory reminded him that influence was cumulative, built over years through observation, patience, and deliberate action. Jackie knew that the true measure of mastery was invisibility, when your presence shaped events and outcomes without ever drawing attention to yourself. As he sipped his drink, Jackie contemplated the lessons the city had taught him. The small things mattered: a hesitation at a doorway, a delivery arriving early, a fleeting glance exchanged between strangers. All were part of the language he had learned to understand. Influence, control, and survival were not immediate. They were cultivated, woven silently over time, and Jackie had spent a lifetime perfecting that craft. Looking out into the night, he realized that the city itself had become a reflection of his own understanding, complex, nuanced, and alive. And in that complexity he found satisfaction, not from wealth or recognition, but from the clarity of awareness, the certainty of timing, and the quiet confidence that he could navigate the unseen currents with precision. Jackie's final thought before sleep was simple, yet profound. The world changed, people moved unpredictably, and circumstances shifted. But those who observed, who understood, and who acted with patience and insight would always find their way. And Jackie Cerone, through decades of vigilance and quiet mastery, had done exactly that. As the night deepened and the city settled into its subtle rhythms, Jackie finally rested, not from fear or exhaustion, but from the quiet contentment of a life lived with awareness, strategy, and deliberate care. The city was still alive, still moving, and tomorrow it would offer new patterns, new opportunities, and new lessons. But Jackie would be ready, as always, to move with them, quietly, thoughtfully, and in complete control. And in that quiet mastery, Jackie Cerone's story found its conclusion, a testament to patience, observation, and the unseen power of understanding the currents beneath the surface of life.